Hi, Linda Vitti from Linda Vitti's Life Coaching and Counseling. And I want to talk to you today about the difference between PTSD and CPTSD. Now, one is post-traumatic stress disorder, which most of us have heard about. And the other one is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the major difference between the two is this. Post-traumatic stress disorder comes from a single event. Let's say you were in a car accident, or you had a traumatic birth, or you were raped. Those would be things that would classify as PTSD events. Now, things like ongoing childhood abuse, kidnapping where you're held for an extended period of time. Now, even the one when we think about soldiers going off to war, they're not usually fighting one single battle. So the chances of them having PTSD are probably less than them having CPTSD, believe it or not, depending on how long and how much they saw action. It would all depend on how many events. So complex post-traumatic stress disorder is basically this: trauma upon trauma upon trauma upon trauma upon trauma upon trauma upon trauma. Where PTSD is there's a trauma and you develop symptomology because of that trauma. So what is the difference in treating these disorders? Well, PTSD is treated with trauma therapy. Both are treated with trauma therapy. But PTSD is basically going over the event in your mind, becoming less sensitive, less oversensitive to the traumatic event, and learning how to process it properly, learning how to understand how your brain has interpreted that event, and things such as this. When you're talking about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, there are so many layers to it that we start to develop behaviors and coping strategies to deal with the ongoing traumas. And they can be very dysfunctional, and they can be very unhealthy for the person. So along with the trauma therapy and along with what we do for PTSD, we're going to be doing learning strategies and behavioral strategies, such as learning to handle overwhelming emotion, learning to handle prolonged triggering, learning to handle when something is a real root for you and it gets exposed. There can be overwhelming feelings, overwhelming panic, overwhelming fight, flight, freeze, or fawn kind of reactions. And we have to relearn to manage them and deal with them in a healthy way rather than a dysfunctional way, which we kind of just, as we were going through the trauma, just learned how to cope any way we could to survive. And as we're going through treatment, we realize we can't use those coping strategies anymore, and it's not beneficial to us. A great example of that is disassociation. I see that a lot with CPTSD people. And dissociation is simply going somewhere else in your mind when you're under stress or under an extreme circumstance. And when someone goes through prolonged trauma, they will dissociate in order to not be there when the trauma is happening. The problem is whenever now they're under stress or they're under severe circumstances, they may dissociate. And so we have to learn how to get them back, bring them back, keep them back, and give them other coping strategies other than the disassociation. But that's a very difficult one to break because it's kind of ingrained in our brain processes as we went through the traumas. And most of the time it happened in childhood. So our brain is almost hardwired that way now. And so breaking some of these behaviors and some of these dysfunctions is a lot more difficult, which makes complex post-traumatic stress disorder a more long-term and a harder one to treat than PTSD when you're dealing with one single event. So chances are, if you've been through prolonged child abuse, prolonged marital abuse, prolonged domestic violence, prolonged any kind of traumatic event that's prolonged and repeated over and over, chances are you have CPTSD. If you've only dealt with one event or maybe one or two events and nothing else in your life was really traumatic, chances are it's probably just PTSD. But only a trained therapist or a licensed therapist can actually diagnose you. So this is just generalities, because a lot of people ask me, what is the difference? How do you know which you have? I think CPTSD is very underdiagnosed, and a lot more people are diagnosed with PTSD that actually have CPTSD. That is just from doing this for 25 years, this is just what I've seen. And I've seen a lot of people diagnosed with PTSD that absolutely have CPTSD, and they never knew it. And things start to make sense when you start to understand your diagnosis. So there's lots of stuff on the internet about this, guys. You can look at the differences. You can look at the symptomologies. There's even quizzes out there you can take and things like that. So the very, very important thing you can do, whether you have either one, is find a trauma-informed therapist. Vet your therapist. Make sure they know about trauma, they know the differences between PTSD and CPTSD, and they know how to treat it. Okay? So we'll see you next time. God bless.